say that the investment climate right now is actually quite poor. The unstable policy environment is just making investment very difficult right now. The unstable policy environment is really just a function of the absence of long-term planning. With the federal government introducing all these various REIT reviews, it makes it impossible for someone to have any certainty on what's going to be happening even next week in terms of where their investment dollars are going. I'd have to say that we're probably all quite bearish, in the sense that you just look at the body language from the government. Most recently, Joe Hockey's observation about wind farms down in Canberra is quite telling of the mood of the federal government. And given that the review is being headed up by someone that clearly has preconceived ideas about climate change, it's very hard to see anything other than bias creeping into this so-called review that the government is proposing. I suggest to you that perhaps with existing investors, I don't think there's too much concern. Australia doesn't have a history of going back on previous legislation, meaning that existing investors would most likely get grandfathered. So I think if you've got an existing wind turbine operation with contracts in place, that should be okay. It's really about that incremental opportunity, which at this point in time is absent in the country. The NEM recently put out a report suggesting that there's about 16,000 megawatts of wind and solar projects that are in various forms of development. We're just not seeing very much of that advancing, simply because nobody knows where the goalposts are going to be next year. Well, clearly, the wind turbines have been the major investment destination for renewables up to this point in time, and given the sort of size and time frames involved to make a successful wind turbine project work, they have at this point probably borne the brunt of the slowdown in the sector. That said, looking at the small end of town, so looking at, say, rooftop solar, the policy environment there is quite stable, though I would suggest to you that the policy is not very supportive. Effectively, all the states have wound back the feed-in tariffs to around 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which, while in of itself still represents policy support for solar, is just not clearly as robust as it once was. I like to actually look at the automobile sector as a good example of where good government policy led to the right outcomes. Just as an example, nobody ever told Toyota to invent the hybrid. Nobody told industry to put turbochargers and increase fuel economy for cars. What actually happened was that the government specified a target, a mileage target or an emission target, depending on which region you're looking at, that basically then force industry to look for solutions, and as a result they're able to innovate and bring answers and products to the problem that were acceptable to the market, and also while at the same time kept the ownership of vehicles very affordable. I think the approach here in Australia needs to be something very similar to that, in the sense that you don't want to be promoting a technology per se, but you really want to be promoting a certain target. So that ideal target really should be about having a low emission energy system that is simultaneously reliable and affordable. So my dream case scenario would be if the government came out and actually put very, very specific pollution targets. And by pollution, I mean carbon, sulfur, SOx, NOx, and mercury. So you sort of embrace all the pollution elements in a sort of single measure, and then encourage or promote industry to get down that path. At the end of the day, what you're going to end up having is a more efficient system that will be cleaner, and it will definitely have more renewables in it, and at the same time we'll be keeping an eye on affordability. That's a bit of an interesting question, actually. The rest of the world, it's a real mixed bag. I'll give you some few examples. So at the extreme end, where you've got the similar sort of pushback to renewable policy as you're having here in Australia, you'd have to look at Spain, where it used to be the global leader in renewable energy, post the global financial crisis, the policy has completely gone 180 degrees the other way, to the point now where the government is even effectively demanding that some of those previous subsidy payments be refunded. A more moderation in the policy is perhaps what's happening in Germany, where the policy structure is still very much unchanged, but the German government has decided to effectively bring down the amount of subsidies that were going towards the space. And at the other end, you've got an improving environment, like in America, where in California and Arizona, they just passed net metering laws that basically guarantees the rights of solar rooftop access to the grid in exchange for a small fee. So I guess it's not really a straightforward answer in saying that, well, the rest of the world is doing one thing and Australia is doing the other. I think you really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But I think the clear message, though, is that in most jurisdictions, they are still leaning towards being supportive as opposed to unsupportive of renewable energy policy. It's a good question. Clearly, I don't think those investment dollars would get lost. Capital in this day and age is highly mobile, and it can move pretty much anywhere where the opportunity set exists. In the case of Australia, we're not a very large end user of energy. Perhaps on a per capita basis we are, but on an absolute basis, as a country, we don't really consume that much power. So in dollar terms, the opportunities here, they would simply just be found somewhere else. That would be the long and short of it. So I think as on a global basis, capital will find its way to the best markets, and that ultimately is good for the planet. But from a country perspective, clearly we are going to lose out.